The pen was still warm in my hand when their lawyer stopped breathing. I had just signed away everything my husband owned, and across the table his two kids were squeezing each other's hands, smiling the way people smile when they think they've won. Brandon already had his phone out. Sheila was crying the good kind of tears. Then their attorney turned to the last page of the trust file, and his eyes moved across one short line, and the smile on his face just slid off. He read it again. He set the paper down like it had burned him. Nobody in that courtroom knew yet what that one sentence was about to do to this family. What it did, I'll never forget. But to understand how I ended up signing away every dollar in that room, you have to go back to the morning after I buried Raymond. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people meet impossible family moments and find out exactly what they're made of. I'm the woman who handed greedy heirs everything they asked for and watched it ruin them. If quiet strength is your kind of story, the kind where the calmest person in the room is the one holding all the cards, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. Now let me take you back. My name is Diana Kirkland, and the morning after we put Raymond in the ground, the farmhouse was so quiet I could hear the coffee maker tick. I had lived in that house 6 years. I knew which floorboard in the kitchen complained and which window stuck in August. Raymond and I married when I was 34 and he was 58, and the whole county had an opinion about that. I kept the books for the farm co-op 2 towns over, so I was good with numbers and bad at caring what people thought. That morning, I just stood at the counter in his old flannel, holding a mug I couldn't drink, trying to remember how to be a person. I didn't get long. By 7:30, I heard tires on the gravel, then a second set, then a third. I looked out the window over the sink and watched 3 vehicles roll up my driveway in a tidy little line, like a funeral procession that had gotten the date wrong. Brandon's truck, Greg's SUV, and behind them, Loretta's old sedan, polished to a shine for the occasion. They hadn't come to grieve. Grieving people don't carpool. I set the mug down and watched them climb out and gather in my yard, smoothing their jackets, checking each other's faces, getting their expressions right. Sheila dabbed at her eyes before she even reached the porch. Brandon carried a leather folder under his arm. I had been a widow for 19 hours, and my husband's family had arrived with paperwork. I didn't open the door right away. I let them knock. I wanted one more minute of the house being only mine, because some part of me already knew that the second I turned that handle, the grieving would have to wait, and the fighting would begin. The knocking got louder. A fist now, not knuckles. I opened the door and they came in like they already owned the place, which, in their minds, they did. Loretta led. She was 67, Raymond's older sister, and she wore her family name like a badge she'd earned in combat. "Diana," she said, looking past me at the living room, taking inventory. "We need to talk about what happens now. Nobody said sorry for your loss. Nobody asked how I was holding up." Brandon set his leather folder on the dining table where Raymond and I had eaten 10,000 dinners, and he opened it, and he started talking about assets. The farm, the house, the accounts, the equipment, the mineral rights on the back 40. He talked about all of it like a man reading a grocery list, and Greg stood behind Sheila with his arms crossed, nodding at every line. Sheila cried softly into a tissue and said she just wanted what was fair, what Daddy would have wanted. I stood there in my dead husband's flannel and let them talk. Then Loretta delivered the line she'd clearly practiced in the car. She looked me dead in the eye, lifted her chin, and said it slow, so it would land. "You married him. We're made of him." There it was. I wasn't blood, so I wasn't real. 6 years of marriage, 3 years of changing his sheets and driving him to chemo, and to this family I was a houseguest who'd overstayed. Brandon slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward me. "We'll start with this," he said. I looked down at it, and my stomach turned cold, because I recognized the letterhead, and I recognized the signature at the bottom. It was Raymond's. Shaky, but his. And I knew exactly what they'd talked him into, and when. The paper was a loan, $180,000, taken against the seed barn and the acres around it 8 months earlier, signed by Raymond when he was deep in his second round of chemo and could barely hold a fork. The stated purpose was repairs to the seed barn. The real purpose was sitting in my dining room with his arms crossed. I remembered the day they got that signature. Brandon had shown up with a man from a lender I'd never heard of, said it was routine, said the barn roof was failing and couldn't wait. I had pushed back hard. I called the bank that afternoon. I asked if I could freeze it, slow it, get a second opinion. But it was a farm operating loan against an asset Raymond still legally controlled, and Raymond, sick as he was still of sound mind, and he signed it because Brandon was his son, and a dying man wants to believe his son. There was nothing I could legally do to stop it. I want you to understand that, because later people asked why I didn't fight harder back then. I did. I just lost. Brandon tapped the loan with one finger, watching my face, waiting for me to panic. The estate's responsible for this, he said. So the sooner we settle everything, the better for you. He thought the debt was a knife at my throat. He thought he was watching me realize I was trapped. But I wasn't panicking. I was doing arithmetic. The same arithmetic I'd been doing quietly for 3 years, and the numbers were landing somewhere none of them could see. I folded the loan paper in half and set it down gently. All right, I said. And something in my calm made Loretta's eyes narrow just for a second, like she'd heard a sound she couldn't place. My lawyer arrived an hour after they left. His name was Walter Pell, a careful old man who'd done estate work in that county for 40 years and had handled Raymond's affairs before I ever came along. I'd called him the night Raymond died, not because I was afraid, but because that's what you do. He sat at my kitchen table and I told him everything they'd said, the demand, the loan, every dollar, every property, every asset. Pell took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Diana, he said, they have no standing to demand that, and I will fight every inch of it. We can challenge the loan, we can contest their claims, we can drag this out 2 years and bleed them dry. You don't give these people anything. He was a good lawyer and a good man, and he was offering me a war. I poured him coffee. Then I said the thing that would get repeated in every kitchen and church pew in the county by Sunday. Walter, I don't want to fight them. Hand it all over. He stopped with the cup halfway to his mouth. He set it back down. I'm sorry, he said. Say that again. Give them the estate, I said. All of it. Every dollar, every property, every asset. Don't contest a thing. Pell stared at me like I'd started speaking another language. He thought grief had broken something loose in me. He thought I was rolling over. He spent 20 minutes trying to talk me out of it, listing everything I'd lose. And I let him, because I couldn't tell him why. Not yet. Telling him meant the plan could leak, and a plan that leaks is just a rumor. So I let the smartest lawyer in the county leave my house believing I was the dumbest woman in it. Word travels fast in a small county, and bad decisions travel fastest. By the end of that week, everyone knew that Raymond Kirkland's young widow was just going to hand the whole farm to his kids, without a fight. The versions varied. In one, I was too heartbroken to function. In another, I'd never cared about the farm and was glad to be rid of it. In the meanest one, the one Loretta was quietly seeding, I was a gold digger who'd gotten caught, and walking away was as good as a confession. I felt it at the co-op on Monday. Conversations that stopped when I came in. A rancher I'd done books for since before I married Raymond looked at me with something close to pity, and pity from a man you've outworked for a decade is a special kind of sting. I kept my head down and balanced their accounts the way I always had, because the numbers didn't care about gossip and neither, I decided, would I. People mistake silence for weakness. They think if you're not defending yourself you must have nothing to say. The truth was, I had plenty to say. I just wasn't going to say it in the feed store where it could get back to Brandon. Some things you only get to reveal once, and you don't waste that on a Monday. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. Sheila. I almost let it go. Then I thought of the one person in that family who hadn't done anything wrong, and I answered. It was Sheila, but it wasn't really Sheila I was listening for. Behind her voice, small and close to the phone, I could hear a child. Aunt Di? Maddie said. Are you still my aunt? That night, after the house went dark and the fields outside turned to black glass, I went into the room Raymond used as an office and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Under a tray of dried-out pens and a coffee tin of rubber bands, there was a folder. Blue, the cheap pressboard kind you buy at the drugstore, soft at the corners from being handled. I'd put it there myself 3 years ago, and I'd checked on it maybe a dozen times since, the way you check that a door is still locked. I sat down in his chair with the folder in my lap and didn't open it right away. I just rested my hand flat on top of it. Brandon thought the loan was his trump card. Loretta thought blood was hers. Greg thought debt would do his arguing for him. and every one of them had walked through my house that morning, past this desk, past this drawer, and never thought to wonder what a careful man and a woman who keeps books for a living might have done with 3 years and a terminal diagnosis. They saw a widow. They didn't see a bookkeeper. People had been making that mistake my whole life, mistaking quiet for empty, and it had never once worked out for them in the long run. 3 years ago, when the doctor first used the word that ends conversations, Raymond and I had done something that nobody in this family bothered to ask about, because asking would have meant treating me like a partner instead of a placeholder. I opened the folder. The top page was crisp where everything around it had gone soft, and reading the first line of it, even now, even knowing every word, I felt my throat go tight. To understand what was in that folder, I have to take you back 3 years, to the day everything got arranged. 3 years before that funeral, we sat in a doctor's office with bad carpet and worse news. Stage 4. The doctor was kind and exact, and he gave us a range of time the way you'd give someone driving directions to a town they didn't want to visit. Raymond held my hand the whole time and didn't cry. He was a farmer. He'd watched things die his whole life, and he understood that the only dignity in it was in being ready. On the drive home, he was quiet for a long while, watching the fields go by, fields his father had worked, and his father's father before that. Then he said, "Di, I need to put everything right while my head's still clear." I knew what he was afraid of, because he'd told me 100 times in smaller words. He loved his kids, in the worn-out way a parent loves children who've disappointed them. But he knew them. He knew Brandon had taken from the farm before and called it a loan. He knew Sheila had married a man who treated other people's money like weather, something that just arrived. And he knew that the day he was gone, they would come for the land, and they would come for me, and that the law in our state would give a surviving spouse a share, but would also give them 1,000 ways to drag it through court until I was too tired and too broke to hold on. "I'm not going to let them turn you into a tenant in your own house," he said. "We're going to do this the quiet way." I asked him what the quiet way was. He smiled, the first real smile I'd seen since the carpet and the bad news. "We're going to go see a man," he said, "who knows more about trusts than anybody in this state." The man Raymond meant was an estate attorney 3 counties away, far enough that nobody local would notice our car in his lot. His office smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco, and he listened to Raymond lay out the whole situation without once looking surprised. Blended family, adult kids from the first marriage, a son with a history, a daughter with a husband, a sister who thought she ran the bloodline. The attorney nodded along like a doctor hearing common symptoms. Then he explained the thing that would, 3 years later, make a lawyer stop breathing in a courtroom: a revocable living trust. I knew the bones of it from my work, but he walked Raymond through it plain. You create the trust, a legal container. Then you move your property into it. The house, the land, the bank accounts, the equipment. You retitle them so they're no longer owned by Raymond the man. They're owned by the trust. And you name who controls the trust and who benefits from it. The beauty of it, he said, is that when Raymond died, anything inside that trust would not be part of his estate. It wouldn't go through probate, it couldn't be fought over in the public estate process, because legally it would no longer be his to leave. It would simply, quietly, already belong to whoever the trust named. "And who?" the attorney asked, pen ready. "Do you want to name?" Raymond looked at me. He didn't hesitate, didn't soften it, didn't add conditions to spare anyone's feelings. "My wife," he said, "Diana, trustee and sole beneficiary. Everything that matters goes in, and it goes to her." I started to object, to say we should leave something clear for the kids so it wouldn't look like a snub. Raymond squeezed my hand under the table. "We'll leave them exactly what they've earned," he said. And the attorney smiled like a man who'd heard that sentence before and knew where it led. Here's the part most people don't know, the part that makes the difference between a piece of paper and a fortress. Creating a trust is nothing. People do it and then leave it empty, like building a safe and never putting anything inside, and when they die, their family finds an impressive document protecting a stack of air. Raymond didn't do that. We funded it. Over the next 2 months, quietly, county office by county office, we moved everything in. We signed a new deed, transferring the farm into the Kirkland Family Living Trust and recorded it. We retitled the farmhouse the same way. We walked into the bank where we'd both done business for years and changed the savings and the operating account so the trust owned them. We even retitled the good equipment. the combine, and the 2 tractors worth real money. I kept the records of every transfer in that blue folder: deed copies, account confirmations, dates, stamps. By the time we were done, Raymond Kirkland personally owned almost nothing. The trust owned it all, and the trust answered to me. I remember standing in the recorder's office watching a clerk stamp the deed, this ordinary woman with a coffee stain on her sleeve, and thinking she had no idea she was loading a weapon. We told no one. Not Pell, not the kids, not a soul at church. Raymond was firm about that. A secret 2 people keep is a secret, he said. A secret 3 people keep is just slow news. There was one thing we left out of the trust on purpose: the old seed barn and the parcel it sat on. Raymond wanted something to stay in his personal name, something that would still pass through a normal estate, so that when the time came, it would look real. It seemed like a small thing, a leftover. I didn't understand yet how much that one leftover would matter, or that it would become the exact rope the greedy would hang themselves with. I used to think Raymond left the barn out of the trust by accident, a thing we ran out of time to finish. I was wrong. He did it on purpose, and he did it because he understood his own children better than they ever understood themselves. If I die owning nothing, he told me one evening on the porch, they'll smell it. They'll go looking, and a hungry man who goes looking will eventually find the trust and find a lawyer who'll picket it. A trust is hard to contest, but nothing legal is impossible if someone's angry enough and patient enough. So Raymond built them a meal. He left the barn and its parcel in his personal name, and he made sure the loan Brandon would inevitably push him into got tied to that personal property, not to the trust. The idea was simple and a little bit ruthless, which is the only kind of plan that survives contact with greedy people. When he died, there would be a real estate to fight over: the barn, the parcel. A few $1,000s in a personal checking account he kept open for show. It would look like the leftovers of a modest farmer. And the family, certain there was more, would charge straight at that estate and demand all of it. Every dollar, every property, every asset, the exact words he predicted they'd use. Let them win the estate, die, he said. Just make sure you never fight them for it. The second you fight, you make it look valuable. Let them think they're taking it from you. I didn't fully grasp it then. I grasped it the morning Brandon slid that loan across my table and told me the estate was responsible for it. Because that was the moment I realized the trap had a second jaw, and they were the ones standing inside it. Back in the present, in the weeks after the funeral, the family stopped pretending to grieve and started building a case. Brandon hired a lawyer named Curtis Dass, a man with a billboard on the county road and a reputation for making people settle just to escape him. Within 10 days, I had a letter from Dass demanding a full inventory and accounting of Raymond's entire estate, with a deadline and the kind of language meant to make a widow's hands shake. I read it twice at my kitchen table, then I made a note of the deadline and went back to my dinner. They were demanding an inventory of the estate. I was happy to give them one. The estate, as far as the law was concerned, was a barn, a weedy parcel, a small checking account, and a $180,000 loan. Everything else, the part they actually wanted, wasn't in the estate at all. But Dass didn't know that, and Brandon didn't know that, and so they kept sharpening a knife to cut a steak that wasn't on the plate. My phone lit up while I was reading the letter again. A photo this time, sent from Sheila's number. Maddie, 9 years old, gap-toothed, holding up a drawing she'd made of a farmhouse with 2 stick figures out front, a tall one and a shorter one, labeled in careful crayon. Me and Aunt Di. Under it, Sheila had typed, "She asks about you every day." I sat with that for a long minute. Whatever I felt about Sheila, whatever I knew about Greg, that child had drawn me a house and called me family with no agenda in the world but love. I set the lawyer's threatening letter and the little girl's crayon farmhouse side by side on my table. One of them was going to matter a great deal before this was over. It wasn't the one with the letterhead. Sheila and Greg came to the farm a few days later, alone this time. No Brandon, no Loretta. Sheila said they wanted to talk private, family to family, and I let them in because of the crayon farmhouse and against my better judgment. Sheila did the talking at first, soft and teary, about how hard things had been, how she'd lost her dad, how she just wanted everyone to be okay. But Greg couldn't help himself. Greg never could. Inside 10 minutes, he was leaning forward on my couch, doing the thing that came naturally to him, which was treating a grieving conversation like a negotiation. He started floating numbers. What if I took a small settlement and signed off quick? What if we avoided the lawyers eating everything? And in his impatience, he let a number slip that told me the whole story. He mentioned, almost to himself, that they needed 110,000 by spring or they'd lose the house. There it was. The store Greg ran had gone under, quietly, the way those things do, and they were drowning. To them, Raymond's estate wasn't grief or justice or family. It was a life raft. I looked at Sheila while Greg talked, and for just a second her composure cracked, and I saw it. The fear underneath. The woman who lay awake doing the same arithmetic I did but getting terrifying answers. She wasn't cruel like her brother. She was scared. And she'd hitched herself to a man who'd spent her father's grave for a down payment. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then Greg said, "So you understand why we can't just let you keep stalling," and put his hand on Sheila's knee like she was a prop in his pitch, and whatever softness I'd felt cooled into something steadier. I understood them now. Understanding is not the same as forgiving, and it is a long way from surrender. If Greg worked in numbers, Loretta worked in reputation, and reputation was the currency she'd hoarded her whole life. She had spent 67 years being a Kirkland in a county that remembered who your grandfather was, and she spent it freely now, against me. She made calls. She mentioned things at church. She had coffee with the women who organized every funeral lunch and bake sale within 20 miles. And she let it be known, sorrowfully, that poor Raymond's widow was being difficult, that blood was being pushed aside, that it just wasn't right what was happening to those kids. She never said a false thing outright. She was too smart for that. She just arranged true-sounding pieces into a false shape and let other mouths carry it. Within 2 weeks, I could feel the temperature of the whole town drop a degree every time I walked into it. And then she said her line again, the one she'd practiced in my driveway. Except now she was saying it to anyone who'd listen. She married him. They're made of him. It traveled. People repeated it like scripture, like it settled something. I heard it secondhand from the woman at the pharmacy, who had the decency to look embarrassed while she said it. Just like that, she reduced my marriage to a transaction, and Raymond's children to his rightful heirs and me to an outsider with my hand in the till. I didn't answer it. Not yet. You don't swing at a punch that's designed to make you swing. But I wrote it down. That night. In the blue folder. On a fresh sheet. The exact words and who was spreading them and where. Not because I needed evidence. Because I wanted to remember, when the day came that I finally got to set the record straight, exactly which lies I'd be straightening, and exactly whose mouths they'd come out of. I drove out to Walter Pell's office to talk strategy, and I made a decision in his parking lot that I'd question a dozen times before it was over. I decided not to tell him about the trust. Not yet. It wasn't that I didn't trust Walter. It was that I'd kept this secret airtight for 3 years, exactly the way Raymond wanted, and the closer we got to the end, the more it felt like the whole thing depended on no one seeing it coming. A lawyer's office has staff, has phones, has a partner who plays golf with people. Secrets leak through good men just as easily as bad ones. So I sat across from Walter and let him keep believing he was representing a woman who'd given up. He had the inventory demand from Das in front of him, and he was worried. "If you won't fight them on the estate," he said, "then at least let me fight them on this loan. 180,000 against you is serious, Diana." "Don't fight the loan either," I said. "Don't fight any of it. Just make sure that when the time comes, everything goes through the proper estate process in open court with a judge. No private settlements, no deals in my kitchen. Whatever they want from the estate, they get it in front of a judge. On the record." Walter looked at me for a long moment. He was a sharp man, and I could see him sensing the shape of something he couldn't quite see, the way you sense a step in the dark with your foot before your eyes adjust. "Diana," he said slowly, "is there something you're not telling me?" I looked him in the eye, this decent man who'd known Raymond 40 years, and I told him the only lie I told in this entire story. "No, Walter," I said. "I'm just tired of fighting." He nodded, and he believed me, and I hated that I had to do it that way. That night I went back to the blue folder, because something had been nagging me since the funeral, and I finally let myself look for it. Behind the deeds and the account confirmations, in a plain sealed envelope I'd almost forgotten Raymond had given me, was a letter. He'd written it the winter before he died, on a bad day when his hands shook, and he'd made me promise not to open it until I needed it. I told myself I didn't need it yet. That night, With the town turned against me and a lawyer's deadline ticking and my own attorney looking at me like I'd lost my mind, I decided I needed it. I slid my thumb under the flap and unfolded the page. His handwriting was worse than I remembered, but the words were steady, the way his voice had always been steady even when his body wasn't. He'd written it plain, no flowery goodbyes, because that wasn't him. The center of it, the line I'd carry with me into that courtroom and carry still, said this: "They'll come for it all, Di. Don't fight them. Let the paper do the talking." I read it 4 or 5 times. I pressed it flat on the desk with both hands like I could absorb it through my skin. He had seen all of this coming, every move of it, from inside a dying body, while his children circled. He'd known Brandon would push the loan. He'd known they'd demand everything. He'd known I'd be tempted, in my grief and my pride, to stand up and fight them, and in fighting them ruin the very trap he'd built. And so he'd reached forward through time, through his own death, to put a hand on my shoulder and tell me to hold still. Don't fight them. Let the paper do the talking. I folded the letter back up and I knew, finally and completely, exactly what I was going to do. I sat in Raymond's chair until almost dawn, mapping it out. And the more I mapped, the more I admired the man I'd married. His plan only worked if I did nothing. That was the genius of it and the hardest part of it. Every instinct I had screamed at me to defend myself, to march into town and tell everyone about the trust, to wave the deeds in Loretta's face, to call Das and tell him his client was chasing an empty barn. And every one of those instincts was wrong. The moment I revealed the trust early, they'd adjust. They'd find a different angle, maybe attack the trust itself, maybe claim Raymond wasn't competent when he signed it, drag a real fight out for years. But if I stayed quiet, if I let them believe the estate held everything, they would do something irreversible. They would formally, legally, in front of a judge, claim the estate and everything attached to it, including the loan. They'd plant their flag on that barn and that debt and call it victory, and once they'd claimed it on the record, they couldn't unclaim it when they realized what it was actually worth. The letter said, "Let the paper do the talking," and now I understood which paper, and when. Not my paper. Theirs. I'd let them write their own demand, sign their own claim, and walk into the trap carrying the bill. All I had to do was be the calm, defeated widow they already believed I was, right up until the second the judge made it final. I made coffee as the sky went gray over the fields. I felt Raymond in that kitchen more than I had since he died, not as a ghost, but as a partner who'd done his half of the work and trusted me to do mine. Then the phone rang. It was Walter Pell, and his voice was tight. "Diana," he said. The court date came through. The estate hearing was set for 3 weeks out. A real date. A real courtroom. A real judge who would formally determine and distribute Raymond's estate. 3 weeks. After 3 years of quiet preparation, everything was going to come down to a single morning, and I felt the clock start ticking in my chest like a second heartbeat. Brandon felt it too, but he read it backward. He thought the deadline was pressure on me, so he turned the screws. He started showing up around the edges of my life, not threatening exactly, just present, reminding me he wasn't going away. He posted in the county's community group online, a long, sorrowful message about families and legacies, and how some people marry in and forget what blood means. He didn't name me. He didn't have to. The comments did it for him. Neighbors I'd known for years lining up to agree, a few of them adding details that weren't even true. I watched it happen on my phone. The public shaming of a woman who'd done nothing but keep quiet, and my thumb hovered over the reply box more than once. I could end it in a few plain sentences. A trust, a deed, a date. And every one of those commenters would go silent and start deleting. But I closed the app instead. 3 weeks. I just had to be patient for 3 weeks. Raymond had been patient for 3 years, sick and dying, holding this whole thing in his head and never once letting it slip. I could give him 3 weeks. The afternoon before everything changed, an envelope came from the court, formal and heavy, confirming the hearing. I set it in the blue folder, on top of the deeds, on top of his letter. The official paper and the secret paper finally in the same place. 21 days, and the family would walk into that courtroom to take everything, and for the first time I let myself feel something other than grief. I let myself feel ready. Let me stop here and tell you plainly where things stood, because this is the moment the whole story turned, and I don't want you to miss it. By that point, 3 weeks from the hearing, here is what I knew and what they didn't. The farm, the house, the bank accounts, the good equipment, every valuable thing Raymond had ever built legally belonged to a trust, and that trust belonged to me. None of it was part of the estate. None of it could be touched by their claims, because you cannot inherit what a dead man didn't own. What was left in the actual estate, the thing they were about to fight me for in open court, was a failing barn, a scrubby parcel of land, a checking account with a few $1,000s in it, and a debt of $180,000 that Brandon himself had engineered. They were marching toward that hearing certain they were about to win a fortune. They were actually about to win a bill. Brandon was still posting. Loretta was still preaching blood at the pharmacy counter. Greg was still counting on a windfall to save his house, and every one of them was standing on a trapdoor, arguing about the view, while I held the lever. I want to be honest about how that felt, because I'm not a cruel woman, and 3 years of grief doesn't turn a person to stone. Part of me ached for what this family was about to do to itself. But a bigger part of me, the part that had been called a gold digger at the pharmacy and watched strangers agree, the part that had kept her dead husband's secret while the whole county called her stupid, that part of me was tired of being underestimated. They were fighting over a house that hadn't legally been Raymond's to leave for 3 years. They just didn't know it yet. And I was going to let them find out the hard way. In public. On the record. With 2 weeks left, Greg made his move. And it was exactly the move I needed him to make. He called and asked to meet, and he came alone, which told me he was getting desperate enough to cut Brandon out. He sat at my kitchen table with a folder of his own and a fountain pen, like props would make him credible. "We don't all need to go to court," he said. "It's ugly, it's expensive, it drags your name through more mud. So here's what we do. You sign a simple waiver now, agreeing not to contest the estate. The kids take what's theirs. Everybody moves on. Clean." He slid the waiver across the table at me, and I looked at it. And I had to work to keep my face still, because Greg had just tried to hand me a gift and didn't know it. A private waiver, signed quietly in my kitchen, would have left the trust hidden and the estate unsettled. But I didn't want the trust hidden anymore. I wanted it revealed at the exact right moment, in the exact right room. So I did the thing that sealed all of their fates. I said no to the kitchen, and yes to the court. "I'm not signing anything in private, Greg," I said. "If I'm going to give it all up, I want a judge to see me do it. I want it clean and final and on the record, so nobody can ever come back later and say I was confused or pressured." Greg's face lit up. He heard a beaten woman who just wanted it over with dignity. He practically thanked me. He gathered his unsigned waiver and his showy pen and went off to tell Brandon the good news, that the widow had folded, that she'd sign away everything in open court without a fight. He didn't notice that I'd just chosen the venue. I'd picked the room where the paper would finally talk. What I didn't plan, what I couldn't have planned, was that the first person to sense the truth wouldn't be family at all. It would be their own lawyer. About a week before the hearing, Das had to do what lawyers do before they walk into court, which is actually read the file. He pulled the public records on Raymond's property, the way any competent attorney would, to confirm what his clients were about to claim. And somewhere in a county records office, Curtis Das frowned. I know he frowned because his paralegal mentioned it later, in the offhand way small towns leak everything eventually. He'd pulled the deed on the farm, expecting to see Raymond Kirkland's name, and instead, he'd seen a name that didn't belong. Kirkland Family Living Trust. He pulled the deed on the house. The same name. He checked the dates. 3 years old. A careful lawyer feels his stomach drop in that moment, because he understands instantly what it means, even if his clients never will. But here's the thing about a lawyer like Das, the billboard kind, the kind who gets paid to make widows fold. He'd already told Brandon this was a slam dunk. He'd already collected a retainer built on certainty, and his clients were loud, confident men who didn't like hearing the word problem. So Das did the thing that would help me most. He told himself it was probably nothing, a technicality, something he'd sort out in the room. He underestimated it, the same way they all underestimated everything, because looking at it straight would have meant admitting the case was already lost. He filed the trust document into the court record as part of the asset disclosure, almost as an afterthought, a box to check. He had no idea he'd just hand-delivered the murder weapon to the courtroom himself, and that in 8 days, he'd be the one made to read it out loud. The week before the hearing, Sheila came to the farm one last time, and this visit was different from all the others. She came without Greg. She came without a folder or a pen or an agenda. She came with Maddie, and she stood on my porch looking 10 years older than she had at the funeral. "I couldn't get a sitter," she said, which was a lie, and we both knew it. She'd brought the child because the child was the one true thing left between us, and she knew it. Maddie ran straight to me and wrapped herself around my legs like no time had passed, and I put my hand on her hair, and over the top of her head Sheila and I looked at each other. "Di," she said quietly. "Is there anything I should know? Before all this?" For one moment I almost told her. I almost said, "Sheila, walk away, take your daughter and your husband and walk away from that courtroom, because you're about to lose what little you have left." But I thought about Greg, and how anything I told Sheila would be in Greg's ear within the hour, and how Greg would find a way to turn even a warning into a weapon. So I knelt down to Maddie's level instead, and admired her drawing and asked about second grade. And I let Sheila stand there with her question unanswered. Before they left, Maddie pressed her crayon farmhouse into my hand, the one with the 2 stick figures. "So you don't forget me," she said. I told her I could never. After their car disappeared down the gravel, I stood on the porch holding that drawing for a long time. Whatever happened to the adults in that courtroom, whatever they had earned, this child had earned none of it. I made a decision standing there in the cold, a quiet one, that I told no one. Whatever I won, Maddie was getting a door out. A fair one, not a cold one. The night before the hearing, I sat at the kitchen table and built the file I'd carry into court. And I built it the way I balanced the co-op's books, clean enough that anyone could follow it and honest enough that no one could break it. The notarized trust document, signed and dated 3 years prior, every page initialed in Raymond's hand on a day 3 doctors would confirm he was lucid. The recorded deeds, stamped by the county, showing the farm and the house transferred into the trust. The bank's confirmation letters retitling the accounts. A simple 1-page summary I'd typed myself, listing what the trust held and when it had been funded, the kind of clear math a judge could read in 30 seconds, and separately, in its own folder, the documentation on the estate, the actual estate, the barn, the parcel, the small account, and the $180,000 loan, with Brandon's fingerprints all over how it came to be. I wasn't bringing a weapon to ambush anyone. That's important to me, that you understand the difference. I wasn't going to stand up and accuse. I was going to stay quiet, exactly as Raymond said, and simply let the documents already sitting in the court record speak when the judge asked them to. The truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be in the room and given the chance to be read. I closed the blue folder and set it by the door with my coat, the way you set out your things the night before something that matters. Then I did one more thing. I took Maddie's crayon drawing and tucked it into the folder too, between the deeds, where I'd see it. Not as evidence, as a reminder of who I was doing this for and who I wasn't. I slept better that night than I had since Raymond died. In the morning, I put on my good coat, and I drove to the courthouse to give my husband's family everything they'd asked for. I have to back up one day, because there's a thing Loretta did that I'll never forget, and it belongs right here. The evening before the hearing, she organized what she called a family prayer gathering at the church hall, and she invited half the county. Officially, it was to pray for healing and for Raymond's soul. Actually, it was a pep rally, and I was the opposing team. Someone, kindly or cruelly, told me about it, so I went. I walked into that hall in my coat, and the room went quiet the way a room does when the subject of the gossip walks in. Loretta was at the front, mid-sentence, and she didn't miss a beat. She turned to me in front of all those people and said, with the saddest, gentlest face, that she hoped I'd find it in my heart to do right by Raymond's real family, and that she'd been telling everyone how she prayed I would stop standing in the way of his own flesh and blood. People nodded. Someone murmured, "Amen." She'd built herself a stage and a chorus, and she expected me to either crumble or explode, because either one would prove her point. I did neither. I stood in the back of that hall and let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable for everyone but me. Then I said the only thing I'd say in public before the hearing, and I said it quietly enough that they had to lean in to hear it. I don't argue with people who never read the paperwork. And I turned and walked out. I heard the murmurs start up behind me, confused now instead of certain. Let them wonder. Loretta had spent her whole reputation arranging true-sounding pieces into a false shape. In about 18 hours, A judge was going to read out the one true piece that made the whole shape collapse, and every person in that hall was going to remember that I'd warned them. That same week, Brandon ran into the first wall he couldn't talk his way through, though he completely misread what it was. He drove to the bank, the one Raymond and I had used for years, and he tried to throw his weight around about the farm's operating account. He was the son, he said. The estate was as good as his. He wanted access, statements, a look at the balance. And the bank told him, politely and immovably, that they couldn't discuss those accounts with him because those accounts weren't part of any estate. Brandon heard that and his face went red, the paralegal's cousin who worked there said later. But Brandon didn't hear the truth in it. He heard theft. He stormed out convinced that I had somehow, recently, in my grief and cunning, moved money around to hide it from him. He called me that night, furious, accusing me of draining accounts, threatening to add it to the case, to tell the judge I was concealing assets. I let him rage into the phone. When he finally stopped to breathe, I said evenly, "Brandon, I haven't touched a thing since your father died. I haven't moved a single dollar. You're welcome to tell the judge that I haven't. In fact, I hope you do." That confused him. He'd expected denial or panic, and instead I was inviting him to investigate. He didn't know what to do with a target that wanted to be shot at. He muttered something about how I'd be sorry and hung up. He spent the next few days, I later learned, building a whole secondary accusation that I was hiding money, sharpening it to use in court. He was so busy preparing to accuse me of emptying the accounts that it never once occurred to him to ask the only question that mattered, not where the money went, why the bank was so sure it had never been in the estate to begin with. 2 days before the hearing, Curtis Das tried to warn his own client, and Brandon wouldn't hear it. I didn't witness this, but I pieced it together afterward from enough sources that I'm confident it happened close to how I'll tell it. Das sat Brandon down and told him there might be a complication with the property titles, that some of the assets might not be where they expected, that he wanted to manage expectations before they walked in. He didn't just say it either. He put it in writing, a formal letter recommending they withdraw the claim before the hearing, the way a lawyer who senses a sinking case protects himself with paper. And Brandon, certain and greedy and surrounded by a family that had decided the farm was theirs by blood, signed an acknowledgement that he'd been advised to withdraw and was choosing to go ahead anyway. He'd heard there was paperwork on my side. He figured paperwork was just a delay, a technicality, the kind of thing a lawyer with a billboard got paid to bulldoze. "That's what we're paying you for," he reportedly told Das. "Make it go away." Das, who knew by then the case was already lost, but now had his client's refusal in writing to shield himself, did the only thing left to him. He took the rest of his retainer and let the courtroom do what he no longer could, which was make Brandon believe the truth. He'd disclose the trust because he had to. He'd read it if the judge asked, and he'd let his client's own greed walk him off the cliff. It's a strange thing, looking back. How many people had a chance to stop this? Walter could have, if I'd let him in. Das could have, if he'd been brave. Sheila could have, if she'd asked her question to someone other than Greg's wife. But everyone in this story was playing the part that grief or greed or cowardice had assigned them, and the only person who knew the whole script was me, sitting at my kitchen table with a blue folder and a dead man's letter, waiting for a Tuesday morning. The Tuesday came. The night before the hearing I couldn't sleep, so I did what I'd done every hard night since Raymond died. I took out his letter and read it one more time. "They'll come for it all, Di. Don't fight them. Let the paper do the talking." I'd read it so many times the creases were going soft, but that night the words felt different, because tomorrow they'd finally come true. I thought about the man who wrote them, hunched at this same desk with his shaking hands, dying and unafraid, spending some of his last good days building a quiet fortress around a woman his own children thought of as a temporary inconvenience. People had spent 3 weeks calling me the fool of the county, but Raymond had never once treated me like a fool. He'd treated me like a partner, like the one person sharp enough and steady enough to be trusted with the long game. And I realized, sitting there, that the best revenge I could take wasn't the courtroom at all. It was simply being exactly the woman he'd believed I was. Calm, patient, unbroken. I thought about Maddie's drawing too, tucked in the folder, and I made my final decision about her. Whatever the estate cost the adults, that child would have a way forward that came from me, freely, with no strings and no cruelty. Because winning isn't the same as scorching the earth, and a woman who burns a child to punish the parents has lost something worse than money. I put the letter away. I laid out my good coat. I set the blue folder by the door. And just before I turned off the light, I said goodnight to Raymond out loud, the way I still did sometimes, and I told him the paper was ready to talk, and that I'd let it. Then I slept, deep and dreamless, and woke before the alarm to a gray morning that smelled like the start of something ending. The courtroom was fuller than an estate hearing has any right to be, and that was Loretta's doing. She'd turned a dry legal proceeding into a public event, and the benches were packed with the same faces from the prayer hall, neighbors and churchwomen and a few people who just liked watching a fall. They'd come to see the gold-digging widow get what was coming to her. The family sat together on the right side, a united front. Brandon in a suit that didn't fit, leaning back like he already owned the room. Greg beside him doing math behind his eyes. Sheila pale and small, Maddie thankfully left with a sitter this time. Loretta in the front row in her funeral best, chin up, holding court even in silence. Curtis Day sat at their table with his files squared in front of him, and I noticed he wasn't leaning back. He was the only one on that side of the room who looked like a man waiting for a storm. I sat on the left with Walter Pell, who still believed he was about to watch his client surrender everything she owned. He'd argued with me one last time in the hallway. I'd thanked him and told him to trust me. He'd sighed the sigh of a good lawyer being asked to do a bad thing. I had the blue folder closed on the table in front of me, my hands folded on top of it, calm as a Sunday. Across the aisle, Brandon caught my eye and smiled, a small, cruel, victorious smile, the smile of a man who's already spent the money. I didn't smile back. I didn't glare. I just held his gaze for a second, then looked down at my folded hands. Let him think it was defeat. The bailiff called us to order. The judge came in, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with reading glasses and 40 years of watching families tear themselves apart over money. She opened the file, and it began. The judge ran it by the book, and the book was on the family's side, or so everyone in that room believed. She confirmed the proceeding was to determine and distribute the estate of Raymond Kirkland, deceased. She asked the petitioners to state their claim. Das stood, and to his credit his voice didn't shake, though I watched his hand rest flat on the trust document in his stack like a man steadying himself. He stated that Raymond Kirkland's children, Brandon and Sheila, as his direct heirs, were claiming the entirety of the estate. Every asset, every property, every account. He said the words, the exact words from my kitchen, every dollar, every property, every asset. And beside him, Brandon nodded along, and Loretta's chin lifted another inch. Then the judge turned to me. And the surviving spouse, she said, looking over her glasses. Mrs. Diana Kirkland, you're entitled under state law to a spousal share of this estate. Do you intend to assert that claim? This was the moment. Walter leaned toward me, one last silent plea in his eyes. The whole room waited for the widow to either fight or fold. I stood up. My legs were steady. My voice, when it came, was quiet and clear, and I'd practiced keeping it that way, because Raymond had taught me that the calmest voice in a loud room is the one everyone strains to hear. No, Your Honor, I said. I'm not asserting any claim against the estate. I'm not contesting anything. Whatever is in Raymond's estate, his children can have all of it, every asset. I'll sign whatever waives my spousal share, here, in open court, on the record. A sound moved through the family's side of the room, a soft exhale of triumph. Brandon actually clapped Greg on the shoulder. Sheila's hand went to her mouth. Loretta closed her eyes like a woman whose prayers had been answered. The judge raised an eyebrow, surprised, because surrendering widows are rarer than greedy heirs. You understand, Mrs. Kirkland, that this is final? You're waiving your legal right to a share of your late husband's estate? I understand completely, I said. Every asset in the estate is theirs. Please, read it carefully. I sat down. Walter was staring at me, and across the aisle behind all the celebration, I saw Curtis Das close his eyes for just a moment, because he, and only he, had heard the second meaning under my words. The clerk brought the waiver to my table. It was a simple document, a few paragraphs in plain legal language, formally giving up my spousal claim to Raymond Kirkland's estate. Walter put his hand on my arm, a last quiet attempt to stop me. Diana, he whispered, once you sign this, it's done, there's no taking it back. I know exactly what I'm signing, Walter, I said. I've known for 3 years. He pulled his hand back and looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. The clerk set a pen on the table. It was an ordinary courthouse pen, but I'll always remember it as warm because my hand was steady and sure around it in a way that surprised even me. The family watched, leaning forward as one body, hungry for the sight of my signature, the moment they'd win it all. Brandon had his phone half raised. I signed. Diana Kirkland in my plain, even hand, the same handwriting that had balanced 1,000 ledgers and recorded a dozen secret deeds. I signed away every right I had to my husband's estate, without hesitation, exactly as the long-form story of my own life had promised I would. The clerk took the paper. The family erupted in the restrained, churchy way people celebrate in a courtroom, handshakes and squeezed hands, and Loretta dabbing at genuinely happy tears. They'd done it. The outsider had folded. The blood had won. Greg was already whispering to Sheila about the house, about spring, about being saved. Brandon was typing something on his phone, probably already telling people. And in the middle of all that joy, the judge, being thorough, did the one ordinary procedural thing that turned their victory to ash. She looked at Das and said, "Counsel, before I distribute this estate, the court will confirm exactly what the estate contains. Please read the asset disclosure into the record, including the trust document you filed." The room kept celebrating. They didn't hear it. But Das did. Das went very still. Curtis Day stood up slowly, with his copy of the asset disclosure in his hand, the same packet he'd filed almost as an afterthought because the rules required it. He'd hoped, I think, never to have to read it. He'd hoped the estate would be distributed on the family's claim and the trust would stay a buried technicality he could deal with later, quietly, for a fee. But judges don't distribute estates on hope. They distribute on inventory. And so the man Brandon had paid to win was now required, by the court, to stand in front of everyone and read the document that proved they'd already lost. He started with the small things, his voice careful and flat. The seed barn, the parcel of land it sat on, a personal checking account holding a little over $4,000. The family nodded along, still smiling, waiting for him to get to the good part, the farm, the house, the real money. He turned to the next page. He paused. The smile was still on Brandon's face, but it had stopped meaning anything, the way a clock keeps its hands up after it stops. Das looked at the page for a long moment, and then he read, because he had no choice. The line he'd found in the records a week ago and prayed wouldn't matter. "Let the record reflect," he said slowly, "that the real property known as the Kirkland Farm, together with the residence and the primary financial accounts, was transferred by recorded deed into the Kirkland Family Living Trust 3 years prior to the decedent's death, and is therefore not part of this estate." Then he stopped. He just stopped, mid-breath, and the silence that came down on that courtroom was the loudest thing I have ever heard. The pen was still warm in my hand. Brandon's smile finally died. "What?" he said. Not loud yet. Just confused. A man who's missed a step in the dark. "What do you mean, not part of the estate?" Das didn't answer. He was still staring at the page like it might change, so Brandon stood up, and now the volume came. All of it at once. "What does that mean? Read it again. Where's the farm? Where's the money?" The judge told him to sit down. He didn't. Greg had gone gray. Loretta's chin had finally come down. And I sat there with my hands folded on the blue folder, calm as a Sunday morning, and let the paper do exactly what my husband, 3 years dead and 1 room away in my heart, had promised me it would do. The judge, who'd seen everything in 40 years but maybe not quite this, removed her glasses and asked the question the whole room was choking on. "Mr. Das, are you telling this court that the assets your clients have just claimed in their entirety are not in the estate?" Das, to his small credit, didn't lie. "Your Honor," he said, "it appears the principal assets were placed in a living trust during the decedent's lifetime. The trust is not part of the probate estate. My clients have claimed, and Mrs. Kirkland has not contested, the estate as it actually exists." "And the estate as it actually exists," the judge said, reading now from her own copy, "consists of a barn, a parcel of agricultural land, and a checking account of approximately $4,000. She turned a page. "Subject to a secured debt against that property in the amount of $180,000. There it was. The line I'd waited 3 years and 3 weeks to hear read out loud by someone other than me. The estate they just won was empty, and it owed $180,000. I watched it land on each of them. Greg got it first, because Greg understood money, and I saw the exact second the life raft turned to an anchor in his hands. Then Sheila, her hand sliding from her mouth to her chest. Loretta last, blinking, because Loretta had never dealt in dollars, only in blood. And blood doesn't help you read a balance sheet. And Brandon, my husband's son, stood frozen between fury and understanding, because some animal part of him had just realized that the loan he'd engineered, the knife he'd pressed to my throat across my own dining table, was attached to the barn, and the barn was in the estate. And the estate was now, by their own triumphant claim, entirely theirs. He'd spent 8 months and a lawyer's retainer and his father's last clear days fighting to win a debt with his own name on the wrong end of it. "The loan," Brandon said. His voice had no air in it. "The loan's tied to the barn." "The loan," the judge confirmed, "is a liability of the estate you have claimed." Across the aisle, Das quietly began putting his papers back in order, the gesture of a man who knows the meeting is over. And I finally unfolded my hands, opened the blue folder, and slid one clean copy of the recorded trust summary across to Walter Pell, who looked down at 3 years of patience explained in a single page, and then looked up at me with an expression I'll keep for the rest of my life. Brandon broke first, the way bullies do when the room stops being afraid of them. He turned on Das, demanding to know how this happened, how his own lawyer hadn't caught it, and Das gave him the flat look of a man who'd tried to warn him and gotten told to make it go away. "I advised you there was a complication with the titles," Das said quietly. "You instructed me to proceed." Then Brandon turned on me, and this was the part I'd known was coming, the part where the man who'd called the estate his birthright realized exactly what his birthright was. "You did this," he said. "You set us up." I stood because I wanted to answer this one on my feet. "No, Brandon," I said, and I kept my voice as level as a tabletop. "Your father did this 3 years ago, while you were too busy circling him to ask what he was thinking. I didn't set anything up. I just declined to save you from a debt you created. You wanted the estate. You demanded the estate. Every dollar, every property, every asset. The court gave you exactly what you asked for. It was all true, and the truth in front of 40 witnesses is a heavier thing than any insult. The loan that was supposed to trap me was now legally his and his sister's, secured against a failing barn worth a fraction of it. He'd manufactured a weapon, and then walked directly onto it. Raymond had told me once that greedy men don't need to be pushed off a cliff. You just have to stop standing between them and the edge. Brandon stood there in his ill-fitting suit, in the courtroom he'd thought he owned, in front of the whole county Loretta had invited to watch his triumph, and he had no move left. No lawyer willing to fight. No fortune to seize. Nothing but a smile he couldn't get back, and an inheritance that had cost him far more than it would ever be worth. Greg didn't even wait until we were out of the courtroom. The mask came off right there at the table, in front of his wife and his in-laws and 40 neighbors, because Greg had bet everything on this money and lost, and men like Greg always need someone else to hold the loss. He turned on Sheila in a furious whisper that carried farther than he meant it to. This was her family. Her father. She'd promised him there was money, that the farm alone was worth a fortune, that they'd be saved by spring. Now they had a share of a worthless barn with a debt lashed to it that no sane buyer would ever assume, and his store was still gone, and his house was still going. I watched Sheila's face as her husband stripped the last illusion away in public, and I saw her understand, finally and completely, what she'd married and what she'd let him talk her into doing to her father's widow. She'd come into this believing she was fighting for what was fair. She left it knowing she'd been Greg's instrument the whole time, that he'd loved the inheritance and used her to reach it. She didn't fight back. She just sat there absorbing it, smaller and smaller, while the man she'd defended turned his ruin into her fault. I didn't enjoy it. I want to be honest about that, because I think a lesser story would have me savoring it, and I didn't. Watching a marriage gut itself in public is not a victory anyone with a heart celebrates. But I didn't look away either. They had come for everything I had. They had called me a gold digger in front of my whole town. The least I owed myself was to witness, clear-eyed and unflinching, the natural consequences of what they'd chosen. Greg gathered his coat and walked out without his wife. Sheila stayed in her seat. alone now, and after a moment she turned and looked at me, and her eyes asked the question her mouth couldn't. Loretta was the one I'd waited for, I'll admit it. Not because she'd done the most damage, but because she'd done the loudest. She'd spent 3 weeks turning a county against me with one cruel, practiced phrase, and she'd packed this courtroom with an audience expecting to watch me lose. So when she rose from the front row, trembling with a fury that had nowhere to go, and demanded of the judge how this could be allowed, how Raymond's own blood could be left with nothing, I finally answered the line she'd been saying about me all over town. I stood and I faced her, and I said it gently, because gentle cuts deeper when the room is already this quiet. You told everyone I married him, that they were made of him, that blood was all that mattered. I let it sit. Raymond made his choice in writing, Loretta. Signed, notarized, recorded at the county 3 years ago, in front of witnesses, while he was well. The blood you're so proud of had every chance to ask him what he wanted. You were all too busy deciding what you were owed. The whole hall was watching the woman who'd organized the prayer rally stand there with her certainty in pieces. Her shape, the false one she'd built out of true-sounding parts, had finally met one true thing it couldn't survive, a recorded deed and a dead man's clear intent. She'd dealt in reputation her whole life, and her reputation had just been spent in public on a fight she'd lost before it started. He left you exactly what he wanted you to have, I said. He just made sure you couldn't take what he wanted me to keep. She had no answer. There is no answer to a recorded deed. She sat back down slowly, an old woman who'd discovered too late that blood is not a legal instrument, and that the quiet bookkeeper she'd dismissed had been holding the only paper that counted the entire time. The judge restored order, though there wasn't much left to restore, and she asked me a final question, and I think she already knew the answer. Mrs. Kirkland, were these parties aware of the trust before today? No, Your Honor, I said. They never asked. I never volunteered it. My husband arranged his affairs legally and privately, as he had every right to do, and asked me to let the documents speak for themselves. That's all I've done today. I haven't accused anyone of anything. I haven't hidden anything that was theirs. Everything that was Raymond's to leave them, the law has just handed them, in full. It was the truth, and it was the only speech I gave, and I gave it as quietly as I'd given everything else. I wasn't there to gloat. I was there to be exactly the woman my husband had trusted me to be, the one who didn't need to raise her voice because she'd never had to bluff. The judge looked at me over her glasses for a long moment, and I'd swear there was something like respect in it, the recognition one careful woman gives another. Then she made it official. The estate, such as it was, the barn, the parcel, the small account, and the very large debt, was distributed to Brandon and Sheila Kirkland, exactly as they had claimed it. My waiver was entered into the record. The trust stood untouched, not because giving up the estate had stripped them of the right to contest it, but because no lawyer would tell them they had grounds to try. She brought down her gavel on a courtroom that had come to watch a widow lose, and had instead watched a family lose to itself. As the room emptied, the neighbors who'd nodded along with Loretta filed out without meeting my eyes, carrying home a story that had not ended the way they'd been promised. I gathered my blue folder. Maddie's crayon farmhouse was still tucked inside it, and seeing it there reminded me there was one more thing I had to do, and it was the only part of that day I'd actually been looking forward to. The aftermath was quieter than you'd think, the way real life usually is after the one loud day. Brandon and Sheila tried, briefly, to challenge the trust. They went looking for an angle, undue influence. Some claim that Raymond hadn't been in his right mind when he signed, but 2 different lawyers told them the same thing. A living trust that's properly funded, notarized, and recorded by a competent man 3 years before his death, with doctors on record that he was lucid the whole time, is about the hardest thing in estate law to break. And without real evidence, they'd only be spending money they no longer had to lose a second time. They let it go. As for the barn, it came to them exactly the way they'd demanded it, with the loan secured against it, and that was the part they'd never understood. They weren't personally on the hook for $1 more than the place was worth. They simply owned a failing barn worth a fraction of the lien sitting on top of it, an asset that cost more to keep than to walk away from. Which is not an inheritance. It's a millstone. Greg never came back. He'd left the courtroom without Sheila and more or less kept walking. Their marriage didn't survive the spring he'd promised would save them. Loretta stopped going to the church where she'd held her rally, and the prideful little phrase she'd worn like a badge was never heard in that county again, because everyone who'd repeated them now remembered how the story actually ended. As for the town, opinion turned the way it always does, fast and shameless, and the same people who'd pitied me started telling each other they'd known all along that the quiet bookkeeper was nobody's fool. I didn't correct them. I just went back to keeping the books at the co-op, balancing other people's numbers, living in the farmhouse that had been mine all along, the one Raymond made sure no one could ever take. There was one piece of business left, and it was the one that mattered most to me. A few weeks after the hearing, I called Sheila, and I asked her to bring Maddie out to the farm. She came nervous, expecting more loss. Instead, I told her I'd set up a fund inside the trust, in Maddie's name, for her education, every year through college, untouchable by anyone but the girl herself when she came of age. It came from me, freely, with no conditions except that it could never be borrowed against or spent by an adult. Sheila started to cry, the real kind this time, and asked me why, after everything. Because she drew me a house, I said, and called me family, and she never asked me for a thing. Maddie was out in the yard while we talked, running through the same grass I'd watched from the kitchen window the morning all this began. Whatever her mother and her uncle had done, that child had earned a door out of it, and I was glad to be the one to hold it open. The adults had gotten exactly what they'd reached for. The little girl got something none of them had thought to want. A clean start. People ask me sometimes, the ones who know the whole story now, whether I feel bad about how it ended for them. I don't. And I've made my peace with not feeling bad. I never took a thing that wasn't mine. I never lied, except once, to a good man who forgave me. I never raised my voice, never accused, never schemed in the dark. I simply stood still and let people who decided I was nothing walk straight into the consequences of their own greed. That's the boundary I keep now, and it's the one Raymond taught me from inside a trust in a letter and 3 years of patience. I don't fight people for what's mine. I don't need to. I just make sure I know exactly where I stand, on paper, and in fact. And then I let the people who underestimate me find out the hard way, that quiet was never the same thing as weak. If you take one thing from my story, take this. Dignity isn't shouting the loudest in the room. It's knowing exactly what ground you are standing on, and having the patience to let the truth be read out loud by the very people who swore you had nothing. That's the day I handed greedy heirs everything they asked for and watched it become the thing that ruined them. The warm pen, the empty estate. The one sentence that stopped a lawyer mid-breath. If you've ever been underestimated by people who never bothered to read who you really are, do this for yourself this week. Know where you stand. Keep your papers in order. And if my Raymond's story moved you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Calm Drama Stories.